Stephanie's presenting, but please feel free to put questions in the chat or ask Stephanie during the presentation. She'll be happy to talk about it and facilitate it. We definitely want this to be a conversation where people can ask questions and there can be good discussions. So please use it as your time and make it the best possible presentation for yourself if you do have any questions. As Brian mentioned, we'll be posting this up on my FYI so you can refer back to it in the future. You can also ask Stephanie questions on my FYI if you have questions about it. And there will be 2 more follow-up sessions regarding classification that Stephanie will be holding. And I just wanted to let everybody know that we will still be posting the basics of federal contracting on my FYI. We have to get that posted up, but as soon as it's there, I'll send out an email so everybody's aware. And so with that, I will pass it over to Stephanie, who's one of our senior classification specialists at U.S. Coast Guard, and a wonderful SME and a wonderful colleague. I'll hand it over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. No pressure. So hey everyone, my name is Stephanie, and first of all, thank you for just taking the time out to be here today. This is the second series for the FYI Academy, so thank you. I won't keep you long. I tend to talk fast, but I'm going to try to slow it down today. So this is the FYI Academy series on classification. My name is Stephanie Philippe Parker, and I'll be your facilitator today. The first of 3, as was mentioned earlier, today we're just going to talk a little bit about classification specialists, the role of the classification specialist. So let's just jump right in. Next slide, please. This is our agenda for today. I'll do a quick introduction for myself. Then we'll talk a little bit about what a classification specialist does, the role of a classification specialist, what skills do they have to have, what a typical day looks like, and then briefly about the 2 upcoming sessions. Just a brief background about me. I started my HR career about 24 years ago as a recruiting assistant. From there, I've held positions such as like a recruiter, staffing specialist, HR administrator. In that HR administrator role, I was able to kind of touch a little bit of everything with HR, like HRIS, payroll, benefits, stuff like that. I've held positions at a top 5 accounting firm, women-owned small business like FYI, and a few private consulting companies as well. About 17 years ago, I started working for the District of Columbia government, and there they use the federal classification system to classify their positions, and that's how I got my start in classification. And then from there, I came to FYI about 10 years ago this year, and I've been assigned to the Coast Guard ever since. In my role here at Coast Guard, I serve as a senior classification specialist alongside some other seasoned classifiers, and we provide classification specialists for the entire Coast Guard nationwide. Next slide, please. Some terms throughout today that you'll hear me use or that you'll see, just in case no one folks aren't familiar, I just wanted to just put these out there. PD is for position description. KSAs you've probably seen before, knowledge, skills, and abilities. GS, general schedule. FES, factor evaluation system. And then OPM, which is Office of Personnel Management. We'll sort of get into what each of those mean as we kind of go through the slides later. Again, feel free to ask questions here in the chat. I'll answer them at the end, and then I'll also provide my email address in case you want to reach out. And then also on our intranet site, my FYI, you can also reach us there. Next slide, please. Before we discuss what a classification specialist is, I think it's important that we define what a classification specialist, what classification is. According to the United States Coast Guard, position classification is a process through which federal positions are assigned to a pay system, series, title, and grade or band based on consistent application of position classification standards. You'll find that this definition is fairly consistent across all federal agencies. It's essentially the process by which classifiers determine what a position is, what pay plan does it belong to, what series does it qualify for, and then determining the grade or the band according to the classification standards. Next slide, please. Now that we sort of know what classification is, we can talk a little bit about what a classification specialist does. The two main roles for a classification specialist are to evaluate positions to determine the title, series, and grade, and also just to serve as advisors to hiring managers. At some agencies, the role of a classifier may vary. Some classifiers may be helping out with like position management. Others may work more or less with helping managers. So it will vary depending on the agency that you're at. In the role of evaluating positions to determine the title, series, and grade, that is always going to be the core role of any classifier. We are responsible for making these determinations based on OPM guidelines, classification standards, and the US code, all of which we'll get into on another part of the series for the Academy. In the role of serving as an advisor to management, again, this could look a little bit different at every agency. Here at Coast Guard, we run into a lot of first-time managers who just don't know what classification is. And then we have a lot of seasoned managers who don't care to know what classification is. But at the end of the day, their end goal is to get someone hired, and we have to help them do that because classification is their first step in that process. It truly is sort of impossible for a classifier to know the details of every job across an organization. So we really do rely heavily on management to fill in the gaps within a PD. Our role is to really just understand the position so that we may be asking questions, we might be guiding managers regarding what should and shouldn't be in the PD. It will just widely vary just depending on how well the PD is written when it gets to us. As mentioned before, the roles may differ at different agencies. I mentioned position management, and that's just where classification specialists or HR specialists, in general, they're making sure the positions are placed appropriately within a department or an organization to help it run more efficiently. And then you may just have classifiers who are just classifying PDs all day and have nothing to do with that. So it could vary widely just depending on where you are. But these are the two core responsibilities of a classification specialist. Next slide, please. So we've discussed a little bit about what a classifier's job is. And so you may be asking sort of like, what skills should a classification specialist possess? It may help to sort of think about it from a recruiting perspective, what KSAs, what knowledge, skills, and abilities are required to fill this role. In no particular order, effective communication is a key skill set to have. This goes hand in hand with the ability to relate to customers and managers. This is important just because not only do classifiers have to be able to write well, they have to know how to communicate very specific, sometimes mundane information, rules, and regulations into sort of layman's terms to varying levels of stakeholders. So in the classification arena, there's no shortage of guidelines and standards. And one of our jobs is to ensure that we're able to sort of summarize and explain that information in a very succinct way. Researching, ability to perform research. Making classification determinations requires someone who's really not afraid of hard work. Someone who's really just willing to put their head down and to work hard, understand what's required of them, and just sort of make final decisions regarding a position's classification. This could sometimes include challenges such as a mixed position, where you may have a job that's performing both accounting and maybe they want you to also do some training in there. So the specialist has to be able to sort of research the guidelines, ask questions, and make determinations about how that position should be officially classified. High level of attention to detail. It's important to be able to pay attention to how OPM is guiding us with the rules and regulations and what they're asking of us when evaluating a position. Details matter as it relates to understanding their directives and when reviewing the PD. For instance, if a position is performing human resources work, but they're required to have knowledge of, say, engineering principles, that's a detail that we should be able to pay attention to during a PD review to notice that something may not make sense. The ability to influence and negotiate, this is specifically as it relates to hiring managers. You'll find that most times they want what they want. They must have a GS-14 attorney position and nothing else. Along with all the other skill sets we just went over, classifiers must also be able to influence and negotiate with managers and to be able to translate their needs into what OPM requires of us. And along with the last skill set of being flexible, it's also our role to be both creative and compliant in how we satisfy a goal. We may have to influence the manager in accepting a lower grade. We may have to negotiate with them and helping them understand why it may not be reaching the GS-14 grade. All of this will just really depend on how the PD is written, the manager's ability to be flexible, and ours, and maybe funding, time constraints, and just our ability to work with managers in an effective way. These are just a few skill sets. The ideal, I would say, attributes of a classifier. I think if you ask another classifier, they would probably have similar KSAs or have additional things to add. But at the core, I believe these skills are a good start. Next slide, please. So we've determined what classification is, what a classification specialist does, what skill set a classifier should have. Now we're just going to sort of get into what a typical day of a classifier may look like. And to be fair, there really isn't a typical day. This is just a general overview of what a process may look like. And of course, it will look a little bit different at every agency. So briefly, we're going to go over what happens before a classifier gets a request, the PD request, what happens when we receive it, what happens during the review and the evaluation, and then once a tentative review is complete. Next slide, please. What happens before a classifier receives a classification request? A hiring manager determines a PD is needed when a new position is established, duties have changed, either due to a reorg or like an upgrade, or the major duties have changed since its last official classification. When I worked at the District of Columbia government, we had a lot of PDs that were just very, very, very old. So that would be a reason to have a PD reviewed again, just because things have changed within the last maybe 2, 20, or even 30 years ago. So they want to put in a request to have it updated. In the background, before it gets to us, the HR specialist is working with that hiring manager to get all the necessary paperwork to make sure that by the time it gets to us, we have exactly what we need. Next slide, please. So here we are, sort of like at the stage where we have the actual PD in our hands. There are 2 important questions that we want to ask before we even begin the review. And the first question we want to know is, why is this review needed? Like, why do we have it? What has changed? Is it a new position? Is it an upgrade? Sometimes you will find that agencies, here at Coast Guard, we have what we call a standardized PD library, which some of our classifiers at FYI are actually working on, where typical PDs or positions rather, like management and program analyst, or maybe like an accountant or an engineer, things that may not change as much and can be generalized and standardized. We put them in a library to allow managers to just sort of go there, see if it meets their needs, pick it up, use it, start recruitment. I like to recommend that be a first step, especially for very common positions. But we really want to know sort of like, why is this PD being submitted for classification? If it's an upgrade or the duties have changed, we want to make sure that we have a copy of the most currently classified PD. And this is just so that we can compare the old PD to the new one to account for the specific changes that were made. Knowing why the action is needed will help us to determine how to approach the review. Next slide, please. The second question we want to ask once we receive the PD is it ready to be reviewed? Does it have all of the right parts, per se? Is it formatted correctly? For purposes of this high-level review, overview rather, we're going to stick with general schedule, which is probably what most of you guys are familiar with, which has the 9 factors on the PD. There are other types of pay systems. You'll see WG sometimes, which are wage grade, which are blue collar positions. But for purposes of today, we're just going to sort of stick with FES when we talk, general schedule positions when we talk about it. When we're talking about is it formatted correctly, we're looking for a few major parts here. The introduction, which is exactly what you expect it to be. It's a brief synopsis, introduction of the position. Usually it has like the location, the organization, where the PD is located, and briefly summarizes what the position responsibilities are. For major duties, what are they doing? How much time are they spending doing it? Sometimes on PDs, you'll see the duties grouped together and given like a title and a percentage. Those are things that we want to pay attention to when making sure that the PD has the right parts. With duties specifically, we want to make sure that the duties are written well. For instance, here at Coast Guard, we sort of like to start each sentence with the verb. They are writing memorandums or they are managing a database. We want to show what action they're responsible for taking, listing out the duties. For the factors, FES and narrative are the types of factors that you're going to see. The FES, again, are the 9 factors that you're typically used to seeing. When looking at the PD for the first time, are they all there? Do we have all 9 factors? In general, are they detailed enough? Does each factor have the right content? For instance, we don't want to see knowledge requirements where the personal contacts are, things of that nature. So we just want to look for things that may generally look out of place. The narrative format also falls under the general schedule, and it's just another way, another format in writing the PD. It has less than 9 factors typically. It's used for specific series. Typically, you see it like with the training series and also sometimes with like intelligence positions. Same content, different look. And it's important to note that on these PDs too, if they're supervisory by chance, we have to have those 6 additional supervisory factors on there as well. Again, we'll get into that on another Academy session after this one. The last one is other significant factors. This is just saying what else is important to know about this position. Is it at a bargaining unit? Does it require a driver's license, a certificate, a drug test, a clearance? So you'll see, most times see that at the bottom of the PD. When looking at the PD to make sure that it has all of the right parts, it's also important to look for things that do not belong on the PD. Sometimes you'll see maybe like years of experience, or they may put recruitment questions on the PD. Those are reserved for the vacancy announcements, so we want to make sure that that is not included on the PD as well. If the PD is missing information, we go back and talk with the hiring manager about what's needed, and then if it looks good, it has all the right parts, then we're ready to begin the review. Next slide, please. So once we've determined why the PD requires a review and that it has all of the right parts, we're now ready to begin the review process. And while I only have 3 bullets listed here for the review process, it is a time-consuming process. Each step may look different for each position that you receive, but in general, these are the responsibilities we have when reviewing the PD. Reviewing the entire PD. OPM provides a classification standard to utilize for each series, and without knowing what that series is, we won't know which OPM classification standard to use for the review and to further determine the title and the grading. So it's important to review the PD as a whole and determine the entire scope of work. What are they doing? What do they need to know in order to do it, etc. When reviewing the PD, we are ensuring that everything makes sense as it relates to the entire scope of work. Do the duties align with the knowledge requirements? Do the methods used to perform the work make sense? Does the level of supervision make sense based on how hard the work is? And the review time is really the time to ask questions and truly understand the purpose of the position. When determining the appropriate series, after you review the PD, most times you'll be able to determine exactly what series the PD should be. This is hands down an accountant or hands down an engineer. Other times you may have to ask questions to management or need to perform some research on varying factors just to determine what the appropriate series is. For an example, the position may be performing inventory work and supply work. So we have to determine which series it should go into. Those things are very similar in nature and belong in the same job family. So we really have to weigh out our options. And again, job families is something we'll sort of get into a little bit later on and with the Academy series as well. And the last bullet here is evaluating the PD against the appropriate OPM classification standard. If we're able to readily determine the job series, we'll find the associated OPM classification standard for that series and perform an evaluation based on that standard. The standard provides a point system for each factor, which in turn determines the grade for the PD. The skill set of paying attention to detail really plays a role during the evaluation, as we have to be able to justify why we chose certain levels for each factor and why. From a high level, we'll also get into this a little bit more during the last session of the Academy series. Sometimes during the review process, we will send the PD back to management. We'll ask them to expand on something, or we'll inform them of something that doesn't maybe make sense to us. Maybe they copy pasted from the OPM classification standard. That tends to happen a lot. We want to avoid that. So we may have a lot of back and forth with management. That could take days, it could take weeks, just depending on the manager's schedule and yours. But our job is to advise them, guide them through the process. And this may include sending them sample position descriptions, maybe directing them to the OPM website, or just simply listening to what they want to become of the position and working with them to get a product that they can successfully recruit with. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of a position description. I'm sure folks have seen them before, but I thought it was just important to just kind of throw this up here. In this example, this is an IT specialist. I'm not sure if it's showing up big, but this also has a parenthetical title. And this is just a title used to further explain the work. In this example, it says PLCY, PLN, which stands for policy and planning, which means that that is probably a big part of their job as an IT specialist. There you see the introduction as well, gives the office, location, and briefly describes what the job is, and then it gets into major duties. Next slide, please. The major duties continue on, and then it sort of goes into the factors. I'll run through the factors really quick. Factor 1 are the knowledge requirements. This is just telling us, what do they need to know? What skill sets do they have to have in order to successfully perform the regular and recurring duties of this position? Next slide, please. Factor 2 is the supervisory controls. This discusses how independently someone is working, how much supervision do they require. Factor 3 kind of gets into the guidelines, what type of typical references or guides do they use to perform their work, how are they using them, what happens if the guidelines aren't applicable, what happens if they're not there, how does this person react to that. Factor 4 goes into the complexity of the work. This is just where we talk about what makes the job hard. What difficulties or challenges do they face in performing the work? And in factor 5 is the scope and effect. And this is just essentially, what is the purpose of the job? And what impact does it have either on the people or the organization? And basically, why is this job important? Factors 6 through 9 are fairly self-explanatory as it relates to who they're in regular contact with and why, and what are the physical demands and the general work environment. Next slide, please. The last page here discusses other significant factors, as we kind of talked about a little before. In this example, like a security clearance is required along with a federal acquisition certificate. So So yeah, so we kind of skimmed through the important parts of the PD here. I just thought it was important to show you guys all of the parts there. Next slide, please. So after the PD is successfully reviewed and the title, series, and grade is determined, an evaluation is created. According to Health and Human Services, an evaluation statement is a written record of the rationale used to classify and grade a position. Evaluation statements are designed to provide consistency and continuity in classification and grading decisions. Each agency does this different, evaluations different, but overall, we have to justify the title, series, and grade, why each factor was received, the points that it did, and the final grade. I'm not providing an example of an evaluation at this time, just because this is just a high level overview, but they do look different at every agency, but they're required to accompany a PD for its final classification. Once the evaluation is complete, you simply follow your agency's process for submitting this back to whoever assigned it to you, and you're done. Some classifiers may also be responsible for updating the OF8 as well. It just obviously will vary depending on what agencies you work for. At Coast Guard, classifiers do not have any engagement with management or HR specialists after this point. The action or the case is closed and we move on to our next assignment. In some instances, the PD might be returned for questions or further explanation, and you have to assist in those efforts as well. Next slide, please. We've gone through what happens before, during, and after a classification request. In general, every day looks different for a classifier, and they could be performing any of these things on any given day. Review multiple PDs. And one day you could be looking at anything from a psychologist to an HVAC mechanic. It just will really differ. Advising management. I find that managers really don't know what they don't know as it relates to classification, and classifiers spend a good amount of time providing information and guidance, and sometimes that could be a big part of your day as well. Creating a PD from scratch. At times, like new offices or departments could be created at your agency where there may be one-of-a-kind positions that never existed before. We could be spending time looking for similar positions online or working with management and creating PDs from scratch, and that could take up a big part of our day as well. A few years ago at Coast Guard, we had a diversity unit that was created in Coast Guard that had never been there before. And all of these new positions had never existed. And so a lot of research can go into sort of talking to management about their needs, what they want people to do. So that could be very time consuming as well. And then also just working on the same PD all day or sets of PDs. This could look something like an HR assistant, all the way up to an HR specialist from like a grade 6 to a 14. That could take up your day as well. It could just, every day will look different. But essentially it's our job to pay attention to the details and ensure that the work we perform is justifiable and can withstand scrutiny. A program or desk audit may happen, and we have to make sure that our work is supportable by the OPM classification standards. Next slide, please. So we have discussed what a classification specialist is responsible for doing, the skills of a classifier, and what a typical day in the life of a classifier might look like. At a high level, I hope this information has been helpful and giving you some insight into the role of a classifier. The next two sessions, the next one will be classification tools and resources, just sort of like what does a classifier need in order to do their job, what kind of tools do they use. And the last one will just be an overview of the classification process itself, showing how the classification process works, sort of how we do our job. So next slide, please. I'm happy to take any questions at this time. And next slide, please. And if there are no questions, please feel free to jot down my information, and you can reach out to me there.
Hey, Stephanie, this is Nina.
Hey, Nina.
Thank you for presenting today. This was great. I do have a quick question. Can you maybe share a little bit? I know at the very beginning you talked about maybe sometimes having to go back and give the hiring managers some guidance. Maybe you have to change what, maybe the GS level, maybe it doesn't fit. Can you just talk a little bit about that process and how you approach that when you do have to go back to the hiring manager and kind of guide them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it really, the way that we approach thing when, let me start over. GS14 attorney, I think, was an example that I gave during the process, right? So if we have a manager that says, this is what I have to have, but they have clearly given you a PD that may be like a GS9, right? So one of the things that I like to do is just say, hey, it's not there, but let me see if I can give you some tools to sort of help us get there, because managers are not classifiers. They don't know. They always say, well, what do I need to put in it to make it a 14? What words are you looking for? So our goal is to say, hey, let me just show you what a 14 looks like. We don't want them to go and recreate the wheel. We want to just really guide them through that process. So GS14 positions not only exist here at Coast Guard, but probably everywhere. Online, you can find some. So we put it in front of them and say, hey, here's about 3 samples. Why don't you take a look and see if anything is relevant to your position and have them update the PD. So we'll take another look at it after that. If that doesn't work, what I typically do is then take a stab at it to see if I can add additional information or take out what we don't need. Because what I want to avoid is having to go back and forth multiple times. But we really just, at least my approach is to say, we can't do it or we can't get you there. Our goal is just to say, here are the tools we can provide you with. So let's start here. So hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Do you find that you get a lot of resistance or pushback from them, or do they typically follow your guidance?
It really just depends on the manager. Since I've been here, I would say most of the interactions, they'll follow whatever guidance you provide to them. They just want to get someone hired. They want to get through the process. If they could avoid classification, they would. So we are definitely like the first stop, and we try to make that as smooth as possible. But for the most part, they'll listen to what we have to say. And after working with them a couple of times, they then understand, I think, sometimes sort of what we're looking for. So it actually helps them understand the process. So the next time they go through it, they can be prepared a little bit better.
I have one more question.
It's okay.
You you had mentioned earlier that you have the HR specialists are kind of working in the background to make sure that certain things are collected and ready. Do classification specialists and HR specialists, or in your experience at Coast Guard, is there partnership or interactions, or is it really kind of separated tasks and duties?
Here at Coast Guard, it's definitely separated. They sort of, the managers, the hiring managers work with the HR specialists first. Then it gets sent to the classifiers to do the actual classification, and then we send it back to the HR specialist. So when I'm working with the hiring managers, it's not also with the HR specialists. They're just waiting for me to get done, and then that way they can do stuff on the back end. So they're sort of like the beginning and the after, and I'm the middle. So very rarely do we have interactions unless there's like an issue at hand, like, they came back and said, oh, they don't have the funding for 12, so you have to go back and do something. So it's very segmented work. Yeah, here at Coast Guard.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
Hey, Stephanie, it's Ronnie. I have a question. And it's
Yeah.
actually maybe more for other classifiers that are on the call. Is there any other classification specialists on the call? And is there anything that's drastically different in your agency from what Stephanie has described at Coast Guard? I'm just curious about that.
It's a great question.
We may not have other classifiers on the call,
Okay.
so that could be why.
They're busy classifying. So I know I talked fast and I went through a lot, but again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or put it on my FYI. And I look forward. I don't know if Ronnie, are you wrapping up or should I?
Oh, go ahead and wrap up. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you guys. That's it. I appreciate you coming. Hopefully it was helpful and I'll see you at the next one.
That was great. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Stephanie.
All right. Bye.